Welcome, everyone, to the Clocking Out Podcast, a show about people who share their own personal journey that include making bold choices to clock out of situations, to follow their dreams of career fulfillment, and to live their best, most authentic lives. I'm your host, Raymond Lee, and this podcast couldn't be possible without the support of Career Minds. Today, I am incredibly excited to welcome Deanna deBara. Deanna's a writer and she's the host of Season of Stuck. It's a fantastic podcast for people who feel stuck in something, whether it's life, career, or they're just trying to figure out how to get unstuck, which quite frankly, I think is all of us at some point in our lives. In our conversation, Deanna shares her very personal story of stuckness, with managing through substance abuse, to making bad decisions, to following many different career paths, and to ultimately discovering her true identity in getting unstuck. Over time, Deanna has realized that stuckness isn't a Deanna thing, it's a human thing. And I love how the science of being stuck and the idea of clocking out and making a change have so many unique commonalities. I just can't wait to share her journey with you today. So without further ado, please enjoy Deanna deBara and her clocking out story. Deanna, welcome to the podcast. It's so great to see you.
Raymond, thank you so much for having me. I am so excited to chat with you today.
Yeah, I'm excited as well. And I have to tell you, you and I connected probably over a month ago, and we put this on the calendar, and I can just tell you that this day could not come fast enough. I just love your story. And I mean, I'm getting goosebumps as I'm just saying this, because as I got to know your story, the thing that really struck me is the podcast that you launched called Season of Stuck. And when I look at your podcast that you just launched over 2 months ago, and when I launched Clocking Out, which was about 2 months ago, we're like, our episodes are neck and neck in terms of how many they're dropping. And I had the opportunity, and I'm really thankful for that time before we got here today, because I was able to do my homework. I listened to your podcast, a couple of episodes. And when I compare your podcast and the mission and the work that you're doing compared to what I'm doing with Clocking Out, there's so much overlap and so many similarities. And I am just excited to share how Season of Stuck, Clocking Out kind of complement each other, but we certainly want to share your story as well. And super excited, very grateful that you're carving out time here today.
Thank you for such a kind and warm introduction. That means so much to me. And the reason that I have been so excited to be on this show is because of that alignment. Like, I think that the desire to clock out of a more traditional career often stems from this experience of feeling stuck. So yeah, I really enjoy all of the stories that you've been sharing. I also had a chance to listen to a few episodes, and I just love hearing. I am like a storyteller and a story consumer at heart. So I love hearing people's experiences of where they were, the catalyst for change, and where they are now. So thank you for creating this platform to share those stories. And I am honored and excited to share mine.
I love that. So what I'd love to do is, as you're sharing your story and your story's unfolding, we obviously are going to look for the clocking out moment, but I also want to understand the moment where you were stuck, because I completely agree. I feel like the stuck comes first, whether you know you're stuck or you're not sure that you're stuck, which is, I find interesting, that whole science. But then once you recognize that, then it becomes making a choice. And so as you're sharing your story, I'd love to understand, when were you stuck before you actually clocked out? But our listeners love when guests start from the beginning. And so would love for you to share where you grew up, tell us a little bit about your parents, what they did, maybe siblings, and we go from there.
Yeah, absolutely. I also love a good origin story. So
Yeah,
happy to share.
love it.
Uh, so I am originally from the Northeast. I was born in New York, and my parents were very young when they had me. My dad was 19 and my mom was 21. So when I was born, my dad was in the process of putting himself through school. Both of my parents worked multiple jobs in order to build a safe and successful life for their family. Um, and it's through that, through watching them and through their dedication and their hard work, that I think I picked up my own work ethic and my own kind of approach to doing things. Um, and also, my parents taught me a lot about sacrifice. You know, being such young parents, I am sure that there were times that they really just wanted to opt out of taking another, side job or side gig or bartending party to go out and have fun. But their main goal was that they wanted to build our family. And so they made a lot of sacrifices. And that was a really, really helpful lesson to me as I moved through my career. Um, my dad ultimately ended up climbing the corporate ladder and was very successful in his career. My mom is amazing. I have two siblings. I am the oldest of three.
Mm,
So I have like absolute oldest sibling energy. And we are pretty far apart because my parents were so young. They kind of waited a little bit in between kids. So I am 6 years older than my sister, 11 years older than my brother. And so growing up, we really did not have much of like a peer relationship. I was definitely more like mom junior.
mm,
um, but now that we're adults, we're friends, which is really cool. My sister is a teacher. She just had her first child a little over a year ago, and he is like, we are all obsessed with him. My brother is currently working a traditional job, but I get the sense that he, like me, has a little bit of the entrepreneurial bug. So I would not be surprised if he himself decides to clock out and start his own business at some point. And he has everything that it takes to be successful. So I will be rooting for him.
I love that. I love how your siblings look up to you and you're sort of carving out the path there. And I appreciate you sharing how young your parents were. My parents were also 20 and 19 when they got married,
Mm.
subsequently separated 8 years later. And I wonder, as your parents were young and they were kind of figuring out their career, it sounded like they made lots of sacrifices. How did that impact your decisions in terms of what you wanted to do for your career? What did you want to
Mm.
be when you grew up?
What's interesting is that I never had a really clear sense of what I wanted to be when I grew up. For me, it like all comes back to, so Elizabeth Gilbert, she is an author. She wrote Big Magic and Eat, Pray, Love. She gave this talk where she kind of talked about how people either fall in one of two categories. They're either
Mm,
jackhammers or they're hummingbirds. And jackhammers find one thing. They find their thing and they kind of hammer away at it for their entire life. And that's where they gain this really deep skill and mastery. And then hummingbirds, they don't really have that one thing. They flip from one thing to another. They learn a little bit about each thing and then they kind of combine them together in different and unique ways to kind of build their own path. And I 100% like fall into the hummingbird camp. I have always, kind of like followed different curiosities and interests and did something for a little while and then moved on to another thing. And so I didn't really have like a clear path of who or what I wanted to be. And that continued into college, when I was on the younger end of my grade. So I was 17 years old when I went to college, which is bananas to me. Like, how am I supposed to know what I want to do with my life? But
mm,
I started off as a communications major. I switched to psychology. I was like kind of very like willy nilly. And then that, kind of incohesion translated to my early career. I had a lot of different jobs. I tried a lot of different things, and it took me a long time to find my way and figure out what path was right for me to take. But ultimately, all of that kind of flitting around and trying lots of different things allowed me to develop like the skills and the perseverance and the adaptability that ultimately served me as I clocked out and started my own
Mm.
business.
Mm. So you grew up in New York, and you have your oldest of three siblings. You went to Colorado State University, correct?
I did go to Colorado State University.
So did you fly across, like you moved across the country? How did you determine that's where you're going to go to school?
Mhm.
And ultimately you majored in something. What was
Mhm.
that? And what were your goals?
Yeah. So my young adulthood is like a case study of decisions not to make. So I went to Colorado State University because that is where my high school boyfriend went to college.
Mm,
And I wanted to continue that relationship and thought that going to school there would be the way to do it. And while there were a lot of things I loved about living in Colorado, it wasn't necessarily my place, and I had a hard time figuring out where I fit in. Um, so would not recommend following a high school partner to college. Maybe it works out for some people. Absolutely did not work out for me. We broke up soon after. Um, but my last major in college was psychology. But during college, when I was about 19, I developed a pretty serious alcohol use disorder.
mm,
And that took me away from school. It took me away from myself. It took me away from everything. And so
mm,
ultimately, I didn't finish school. And that was a really big source of shame for a long time. I felt like I had failed and that I was never going to have the life that I could have had because I didn't see that through. Um, but ultimately, I stopped drinking a little bit. It'll be 15 years on December 31st of this year.
mm,
And since then, I have built a career despite the fact that I did not graduate from college that like I'm really proud of and excited about. So while I think that college is such a valuable experience and it taught me a lot about myself and about life, um, I ultimately did not let the fact that I don't have a degree hold me back from pursuing the things that I wanted to pursue. And I was very lucky in that I was able to build my business and be successful despite my not so great choices in my late teens and early 20s.
mm. Deanna, I appreciate you being vulnerable. I feel like your identity has evolved over the last several decades, and I can only imagine the feeling as you've made some of these decisions, which ultimately you had these feelings of shame and you struggle with who you are as a professional and entering the workforce, and then having um, the exposure to alcoholism and things like that. The I wonder how and when did you really sort of connect to that identity,
Mm,
and it was no longer going to hold you back. Like I feel
mm,
like there are throughout a person's life or career, there's an identity struggle that
mm,
individuals face, whether it's connected to family or connected to their education or other things. And I wonder when that moment was when you sort of were like, yes, this is who I am. And you almost own the identity.
mm.
And how did that impact your ability to move forward?
Mm. You could not be any more accurate. I like to joke, I feel like I'm like Taylor Swift with the number of eras that I have had over the past 2 decades. It really has been this continual evolution of stepping into the next version of myself, of my life, of my career. And there has been a lot of like change and evolution through that process. So really my professional life as it is today like didn't start until I stopped drinking. So that was when I was 25 when I really started to work professionally. And I had this sense of being behind and everybody had already accomplished all of these things and I was at the starting line. And again there was this shame of like being in interviews and trying to find a way to explain the fact that I didn't finish school in a way that like didn't make me look bad.
Mm,
And I carry that with me through the bulk of my 20s, this feeling of inadequacy for not finishing school and not seeing it through. And then right around the time that I turned 30, which is also around the time where I started to explore the potential of starting my own business, I looked back on my career and the last few jobs that I had had, and I looked at the feedback that I had received. I looked at what I had been able to do in those jobs, and I was able to give myself a little bit of credit. So instead of leaning into the feelings of inadequacy, I led into the feelings of pride of what I had been able to accomplish and where I had been able to take myself, despite the fact that there was this thing that I considered to be a roadblock in my way. And that kind of changed the way that I thought about things. And then the more successful I became, the more I just accepted that as a part of my story, that I wouldn't be who I am today if I didn't go through the struggles that I went through when I was in college and shortly after. If I didn't have an alcohol use disorder, I would have never done the work to stop drinking. And that work shaped who I am fundamentally as a human being and plays a huge part in everything that I have been able to do since. So my attitude today at, I'll be 40 in a few months is that I have a lot of gratitude for those experiences. They were not fun. They were not happy times. I felt very, very, very stuck in my drinking. But that stuckness and those challenges preceded the growth that follows. And that growth is ultimately what contributed to me being the person, the business owner, the writer, the creator that I am today. And so now I look at that with gratitude.
I love that. There's so many things to unpack there. I was thinking about, so you're 25, you're at this place where it's so clear you're stuck and you're trying to figure out, where do I go? And one thing that popped in my head was the book of Annie Duke. She wrote a book called The Science of Quitting, and she described a tumbleweed, how throughout your, like, I think of it as your teens to your 25, how this massive tumbleweed has rolled and it accumulates stuff, and you get to the point of you being 25 and the weight of all of the stuff that's accumulated over that decade makes it almost insurmountable to unravel all of those things and become unstuck. And when you were saying gratitude, the first thing that popped in my head was your mindset shift. You went from this fixed mindset to someone who is recognizing that in order for me to move on from this really dark period, I need to first get unstuck, unravel, and shift my mindset. And it's like day one, what is Deanna grateful for? And just writing that one thing, the air that you breathe, the earth that you walk on, like the simple things. And
Mm-hmm.
I can only imagine that day one after 25, that you start recognizing that there's so many positive things in your life that you're grateful for. And also the affirmation that you can give yourself of the value, who you are as a person at the core is is the place where you begin. And I so appreciate you sharing that. It makes so much sense. It's interesting because our lives are like almost a parallel path in terms of your journey and my journey. And it's so interesting about how you made that choice. And I just
Mm-hmm.
think it's fascinating.
I've never heard the tumbleweed metaphor, but that is such a beautiful way to think about it, because it was accumulation of trauma, bad decisions, mistakes, like
Mm,
heaviness, shame, all of these things that built up. And it did feel, when I got to the point where I realized that I had to stop drinking, and like, not to be super heavy, but it really felt like this decision of like, I can stop drinking or I can die early. And like, those are like my two options. And, I chose to stop drinking. And that journey was challenging and frustrating and hard and beautiful and life affirming and like all of these things. And now, like, when I look back to your point, like, I do feel that like that was the starting point. Like that was when I look back on where my life as it is today began, all of it, my relationships, my marriage, my career, my business, all of those things, it stems from that decision and then the shift that followed.
Mm, I love that. So let's talk about the shift.
Mm-hmm.
I know that the work that you're doing today with your writing and content creation and your podcast isn't where it started. And
Mm-mm.
so I wonder if you can share, what that journey looked like and what was ultimately the pivot from what you're doing at that point to leaning into really the work that just motivates you and gives you so much life meaning and purpose.
Yeah. So my 20s into my early 30s, my career was a winding road, if I'm being generous. It
Mm,
was like, I worked at a digital marketing agency. I worked at a rehab. I worked as a sales executive for a skincare line. I worked as a recruiter. Like there were all of these jobs that I would get hired and I would be at for a year and a half, maybe 2 years. I would do a really good job. I would excel. I would get bored. I would leave. And I
mm,
repeated that process over and over again for, 6 or 7 years from the time I was in my mid 20s to my early 30s. And I think that part of that was me trying to figure out who I was as a professional and like what my strengths were and where I excelled and what I liked doing. And then I think part of it was this desire for approval or acceptance. Like I wanted to prove that I could do a good job, that like I could be a good worker. Like I almost felt like I had to make up for lost time. And so I would hustle, 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 do really well, but then eventually kind of disengage and move on to the next thing. And then it was in my last job. So I was a recruiter at an agency in Los Angeles. And it was just not a good situation for me. Like the culture was not a fit. The job wasn't really a fit. I had that feeling where I would wake up in the morning with a sense of dread of like having to go into my job. And like I was grateful to have a job, but just everything inside of me was screaming, like, this is not right for you. But I felt stuck because I didn't know what else I wanted to do. I didn't know what else I could do. Um, and I had a conversation with my then boyfriend, who is now my husband, who was feeling kind of similarly ready to move on from his role. And we were talking about what the next chapter of our life could look like. And we decided that we wanted to travel, that we wanted to backpack, go on like a long term trip, and then reverse engineering that, we would have to figure out what we could do while we were traveling to support ourselves. And I have always loved to write. From the time I was a little girl, it's always been like a part of my creativity. I'm a lifelong journaler, creative writing. There was an element of writing in a lot of my jobs. So I knew that it was a skill that I had that could potentially be marketable. And so I decided that I was going to write. I was going to try to build a writing business. And it was at that point it was like so interesting because I could see as I was starting this business the purpose that all of my other jobs had had and how it had led me to that point and served me well. So, for example, as a recruiter, part of my job was business development. I had to find new clients, I had to cold pitch, and that played a huge part in building my writing business. As a sales account executive, I had to like educate people on the value of our products. And as a business owner, I had to educate clients on the value that I could bring to their businesses. When I worked in the digital marketing agency, it was a lot of, kind of like brainstorming and idea generation, which I then applied towards figuring out things to write about, potential companies to pitch, outlets that I wanted to be published in. So, really, while my career journey up until the point that I clocked out seemed very disjointed, and even I experienced it as disjointed, when I found the thing that I wanted to do and the business that I wanted to build, all of that experience like came together to support me in my success. So again,
Mm.
coming back to the gratitude, now when I look back, I am grateful for all of those jobs that weren't the right fit. And I'm especially grateful for the last job that was really not a good fit, that made me feel so stuck, because that is ultimately what inspired me to say, I don't want to do this anymore. I'm going to try my own thing. And it was one of the best decisions I've ever made.
Mm. Wow, that's fascinating. So I have to ask this question.
Mhm.
When you're at that place where you had this feeling of being stuck and you were having what appears to be a lot of negative feelings about the role that you were in, the company, the culture, people that are listening, they're probably like, yep, that's me today.
Mhm.
If I go back to that book by Annie Duke, Quitting, for a moment, where you have this tumbleweed that sounds like it's been building and you're now at this kind of a new crossroad, what keeps you from persevering in grit and grinding it? Like, you've made a choice
Mhm.
and you went on this trip, which, by the way, I think is a fantastic idea, because when you're reflecting on a life change and you take yourself out of your normal day to day and you go on a vacation or you go somewhere where it really allows you to think and have perspective and then come back and then decide, okay, this is what I'm going to do, which sounds like a fantastic idea.
Mhm.
But so many people say the way to fix this is to grit, is to
Mhm.
grind. If I double down and I work even harder, it's going to get better. And I wonder if you have any advice, or as you reflect
Mhm.
back, if those questions came up, those stories came up that
Mhm.
said, Deanna, you really, in order to fix this, you need to keep going and work even harder. And how did
Mhm.
you tell yourself no?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's like two experiences that you can have, or that I had,
Hmm.
and I have heard of other people having in that situation. There's what you just talked about, this idea, if I just put my nose to the grindstone and I just like hammer it out, eventually I'm going to get paid more, or I'm going to get promoted, or I am going to enjoy my job, my company, my team more. Or there is this other instinct where it's like, I just want to throw it all away and walk out the door right now and never look back. Right. So there is the, I'm going to commit and just push through and like keep pushing, pushing, pushing until it works. Or I just want to walk away today because this doesn't feel like the right fit. And I experienced both of those like intuitive feelings at different times. But the approach that I took for clocking out was in the middle. So I knew that I wanted to make a change. I knew that intuitively that this job was not a fit, and that if I really was honest with myself, that none of my jobs had been a fit. And maybe that was because I wasn't supposed to have a traditional job.
Hmm.
And I also recognized that building a business and like doing your own thing takes time, energy, perseverance, grit, that I wasn't going to walk out of my corporate job and then the next day be making the same amount of money that I was when I left that job in my business. So I took almost a year while I was still working full time in my job, building my business on the side. And that was an incredibly valuable experience for a number of reasons. One, it showed me that there was a market for what I was offering and that I had what it took to build the business. And the more I built it, the more confidence that I got. It also, interestingly, made everything at work feel more bearable because I knew that I wasn't in it anymore. I was disconnected from that. I have to push. I have to make this work. I have to do the best job. I was like, I'm going to show up. I'm going to do my job. I'm going to like do as good of a job as I can. But I know that this is a temporary situation and I am putting my energy and my passion and my talent into building my own thing. And then when I was ready to make that leap, when I had built my writing business to the point where I couldn't grow it anymore while still working a full-time job, that is when I made the leap. And then that shortly after is when we went traveling. And that I just felt like it was a really, really helpful way to approach it because it removed that mindset that you were talking about, that like almost forcing myself to make it work. But I also felt like I had a little bit of a sense of security when I made that transition, which I found to be super helpful.
Mm, that's so great. I love how you describe this shift of energy where you recognize that the job wasn't going to be the job. And it was first really around where am I going to commit my energy? And when I think about this, kind of like the question I was asking about where are you going to spend the time, you knew it wasn't going to be there. And so you started to sort of formulate your plan of what the next step's going to look like. And I love that you described it as energy. I was kind of grinning because that's how I was thinking about it, is that, for people listening, you're in this situation, and the idea of the stress to be able to commit an equal amount of energy in two situations, if you know one is not going to be sustainable long term, then don't try to keep all the balls in the air. Take that 50% of the energy that you would have in the existing role. You obviously need a steady income, the benefits, all the things that come with that. But while I can only imagine, you get up in the morning, you're having your coffee, you go home, you go to bed, you're thinking about this new venture, and you're formulating that in your head. And so it was just so beautifully articulated. And so you ended up launching your writing business. And tell me about, I did a little bit of homework,
Mm.
but I want to hear where your focus was, because I find it really interesting in some of the areas that you were creating content for.
Mm. This is such an important part of my journey. So I'm really glad that you brought that up. Um, so prior to COVID, I felt like my work was pretty evenly split between work that paid the bills, which as a business owner, sometimes you have to do, and work that I genuinely felt passionate about and that was aligned with myself, with my values, with my interests, that felt exciting to write and exciting to put out there. And that felt really satisfying, right? It felt satisfying to spend a significant amount of my time writing about things that I cared about, which for me, a big part of it is wellness. I fell into the cannabis space. I have written about psychedelic assisted treatment for depression and, PTSD and things like that. Um, I've written about exercise, which has like been a very big part of my life post drinking. Exercise and all the endorphins that go with it has really like impacted my life for the better. So getting to write those stories has been really great. I got to do a lot of first person stories. So where I would get to try something like new and interesting that I was excited about and then like write a piece about it. I wrote a piece for Men's Health about sensory deprivation tanks, which was a very interesting thing to take a deep dive into. Um, but when COVID hit and I started shifting more towards content marketing versus more like editorial or first person pieces, there was a part of me that started to feel less satisfied in my business, less satisfied, burned out, overwhelmed, not as excited about what I was doing as I used to be. Um, and I felt very stuck. And what's
Mm,
something that I think is important to highlight is I think that a lot of people, when they think about the entrepreneurial journey, like that the end of the story is starting the business and then being successful and then happy ending. But being a business owner, being in the freelance space, it's an evolution. Like there are ups and downs. And while I found a lot of purpose and engagement and inspiration from what I was doing for a long time, there were also periods where I didn't feel so inspired. And I went through a period of that kind of lack of inspiration and feelings of stuckness a few years ago. Um, I wasn't working on as many projects as I was passionate about personally. I really loved the clients that I worked with, but the things that I was writing was not super exciting or like aligned with what I wanted to be doing. My industry was changing. Generative AI, the economy, there have been lots of things that have impacted the writing industry. And I felt kind of at like a stuck place. You know, what I was doing before was no longer working, but I didn't know what I wanted to do next. I
Mm,
knew that the version of myself that I was no longer a fit, but I didn't know what the next version of myself looked like. It hadn't emerged yet. And so I was in this stuck place for many, many months. And it was in exploring that and figuring out what was happening with me, why I was feeling stuck, how to get myself unstuck, that I ultimately found my next project and found that next dose of inspiration and found the thing that reignited that spark, which was creating Season of Stuck.
wow. I love that. Absolutely love that. You reinvented yourself
Mm-hmm.
essentially. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that as individuals go through their life and their career, that reinvention is something that it's hard to do. It's so hard to do. And there are milestones I feel like people experience. Retirement, certainly one of them. You know, when you work in a corporate world or in your situation where you have multiple jobs and you get to a certain age, there's a light bulb that goes off, and reinventing yourself late in your career where you're trying to figure out what is my purpose, what's my legacy going to be.
I think that one of the most impactful gifts that we can give ourselves
Mm,
is the permission to change, right?
mm,
Like you can go down one path and get to a certain point and say, this actually isn't the path for me, and find another path. And that is okay. It is okay for your values to change. It is okay for what you want from your career, from your life to change. And it's okay to want to do something different. And I think that we often, to your point, particularly within like the construct of societal expectations, and you should be at a certain point at a certain age and you should check all of these things off of the list in order to be successful, that we stay too long in situations that are no longer serving us. So I think that
mm,
like for me, one of the most helpful, impactful things that I have done for myself is given myself permission to change at any point. Like, I don't have to be who I was yesterday, and tomorrow I don't have to be who I am today. And that has been at times, felt scary. Change can be scary, but it has also led me to so many interesting, fun experiences. And I feel like when I look at my life at any given point, it really feels like a reflection of
mm,
who I actually am in that moment, not who I was before or who I'm trying to be in the future.
mm.
And that's been a gift.
I love that. That's so well said. So tell me about Season of Stuck.
Yeah.
What types of guests do you bring on? What's your focus area?
Hmm.
And what should people experience in terms of listening to it?
Yeah. So, Season of Stuck is a podcast about what I now know is the very human experience of feeling stuck, how and why we get stuck, what that can feel like, how to learn and grow from it, and ultimately how to get unstuck and step
Mm,
into the next version of ourselves in our lives. Um, I, as you can tell from my story, I am a person that has felt stuck a lot. And in those periods of stuckness, it always felt very personal, like it was a personal failing, like I was falling short in some way. But the more I started talking about the experience of stuckness, the more that was mirrored back to me. Like everyone, every single person that I have talked to has had their own season of stuck, or like me, many, many seasons of stuck. And so I realized that it was a universal experience. And that's ultimately what led me to creating the podcast.
mm,
And on the podcast each week, we talk to an expert and we explore stuckness from a different angle. So that can include everything from personal growth to relationships to health and wellness to career and entrepreneurship. So, for anyone who is thinking about clocking out or starting an entrepreneurial journey or making a change in their life, in their career, my hope is that we can offer support as you figure out your own stuckness, figure
Mm,
out the best way forward, and then take steps towards the new version of you.
I love that. So I listened to a couple of shows, and the one thing that I found super relatable was how when I listened to a show, it connected to me in some way around where in my life I was stuck.
Mm.
And in certain cases, I've made a decision. But even more recently, which has ultimately led me to starting clocking out, was this idea very similarly to you, where I felt stuck. I was a point in my career where I knew I wanted to do something different, and it took me a while to get there. But I wonder how many people would you say, what percentage of people actually don't know that they're stuck? They know
Mm-hmm.
something's wrong, but they
Mm-hmm.
don't there's not a label that it's
Mm-hmm.
stuckness. It's just
Mm-hmm.
a funk, or
Mm-hmm.
I'm at a point, or I'm at a crossroad and I'm trying to, but it's like, no, we have to label it. You're stuck.
Mm-hmm.
And we need
Mm-hmm.
to figure out how do we get you unstuck. And Deanna, there were points in my life where I didn't realize I was stuck until later. And I
Mm-hmm.
realized what was holding me back was my ability not to recognize, shine a light on it, and then determine what's the path forward. And I
Mm-hmm.
wonder how many people actually are stuck but don't actually know it.
Oh my gosh, a ton of people, myself included. I
Mm,
when I look back, I absolutely have had periods of stuckness that I didn't have the language or the understanding to name. I don't think it's something that we talk about a ton. This idea of like what inertia actually is. Like when we find ourselves kind of waking up and going through the day and like maybe things aren't great but they're also not terrible, but like you want to be different but you don't know how you want to be different. Like there's not a lot of conversation around that. At least
mm,
I have not been exposed to a lot of conversation about that. So it can be hard when you're experiencing those things to identify like what exactly is going on. Like what is off? Am I sad? Am I in the wrong relationship? Is this career path not the right one for me? And it can be challenging to like really pinpoint where that source of the stuckness actually is.
mm,
And I think, again, I can only speak for myself. When I look back on those periods when I have been able to pinpoint what's going on and figure out a way forward, it always comes from like self-reflection. Like I am a big journaler. I will literally write out a list of questions that I want to ask myself and then write out the responses, and I tend to find a lot of answers within that space.
mm,
Almost in like having a dialogue with myself,
mm,
because I, like many people, I would argue even all people, can have blind spots and things that I don't really want to look at. And I find when I am intentional in examining where I am and what isn't working and what am I actually feeling and where do those feelings actually come from, that is where I find the clarity that I need to not only identify where I'm stuck, but to kind of shake it off and figure out how I want to move forward and then actually take steps towards that new destination.
mm. Well, I have to say, I'm a huge fan. I've subscribed, already started listening to several episodes. I'm going to tune in weekly. And I can only imagine that your two siblings are looking up to you, and, you're helping them pay the way
Mm.
to becoming unstuck, because everyone gets stuck. And so the fact that you're providing content to help people work through that, I think is fantastic.
Right back at you. Thank you for creating this podcast and putting this information out there. When I was thinking about clocking out of my kind of traditional career path, it was so scary and I felt really alone. and
Mm,
like I was doing something that was so outside of the realm of normal that it felt like a risk. And
mm.
so sharing these stories and normalizing this path is going to help so many people who are in that place have the courage and confidence to create a life that really reflects who they are and what they want. So I am a fan, and I am so
Thank you.
excited to see where this podcast goes.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And we only have one life, right? We have to make the
Mhm.
most of it.
Mhm.
And Deanna, thank you so much. This has
Mm.
been absolutely so delightful. So many great nuggets, so much love. Really appreciate our conversation here today. How we'll have everything about your company and everything about the podcast in the show notes. But for those listening and who want to rush to connect with you, what's the best way to do that?
Yeah, so you can visit my website, seasonofstuck.com. You'll find all of our episodes, and you can sign up to have episodes delivered to your inbox every week. You can also find me on Instagram at Season of Stuck or on YouTube at Season of Stuck.
Awesome. Great. Thanks so much, Deanna. And thanks everyone for listening. Until next time. Hello, Raymond again here. Thank you to our sponsor, Career Minds, a global provider of outplacement and career development services. And if you'd like to connect with me about your own personal career journey, you can connect with me on LinkedIn, as well as finding me on Instagram at raymondlee.co. And until next time, remember, if you're stuck or unsure of your career or future, I would encourage yourself to ask yourself these 3 questions. Does my career or work make me feel alive? Am I doing the things that matter to me most? And am I creating value for myself and for others? Until next time.